Welcome. My name is Cindy Wright, and I'm a program manager at the Child Neurology Foundation. Today, we're talking about social emotional learning and our new normal with a focus on children and families with neurologic conditions. We recognize children are facing different circumstances due to school rules and their own health challenges, and we know that whether children are distance learning or going to school with social distance and mask requirements or going to school with no COVID restrictions, there has been a significant impact on their interactions with peers and teachers. We're joined today by two experts in this area, and I'm excited to listen to their discussion and learn. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me today. Why don't we start off, Dan, with you introducing yourself?
Great. Thanks for having us, Cindy. My name is Dan Porter. I am a school social worker on special assignment at Northeast Metro 916. It's an intermediate school district that mainly supports kids in special education. I am a master's level clinical social worker, and I am on the board for MISWA, which is Minnesota School Social Work Association, as the professional development chair. And I'm the board president for MACMA, which stands for Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. And I guess what I think is kind of the most important piece is I'm a parent too of two children. One who just turned 8 yesterday, and the other one is 19 years old, and he's in a 18 to 21 transition program. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Nice to virtually meet you, Dan. I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Nick Woolf. I'm currently working at Panorama Education, which is a education technology company here in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm based. And we work with schools and districts K through 12 around the country to help measure and analyze student and adult social emotional learning. My background is more on the research and academic side. So I have a master's degree in social emotional learning and child study human development from Tufts University. I also serve on the steering committee of the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts, which is a nonprofit here in the state of Massachusetts that helps to advocate for policy and effective implementation of social emotional learning. And how I got connected with Cindy is I actually started a few years ago Inside SEL, which is an online media outlet and blog that's really focused on curating headlines, policy updates, research pertaining to SEL. So long story short, I'm a huge SEL nerd. Always love talking research. And one of my favorite parts about my role with Panorama is that we have a bird's eye view into really districts across the country. And these past several months have gotten to see and learn from and with them around how they're approaching social emotional learning in distance or hybrid learning environments. So really excited to talk about that today.
Great. Yeah, well, we just have some questions that we'll kind of go through and hopefully we can kind of have some thought and discussion on it. So first one I have is everyone is talking about the importance around SEL, so social emotional learning. These days, I'm hearing about it every day when I think about the context of the school systems and services we provide within a school. Can you give a quick overview of what social emotional learning is for all of us?
Definitely, and it's certainly a term and a field that's risen in popularity. Really been a trending topic this past, I would say, 8 to 10 years. But to define it, social emotional learning, or commonly referred to as SEL, it's the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And that definition comes from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which is commonly referred to with the acronym CASEL. It's widely considered to be the, I would say, authoritative voice for social emotional learning research, practice, and policy. And they first coined the term social emotional learning 26 years ago. And obviously it's evolved quite a bit since then. And they actually just released an update to their definition of SEL a a few weeks ago, it was back in October, that the new definition basically expands the aperture to kind of more clearly define the role of social emotional learning, both in terms of promoting equity in education, but also acknowledging the context and environment in which students live and how that can't be disassociated from their academic, social, and emotional development. So it's a rapidly evolving field, both in the sense that it's growing in popularity in K-12 and also in higher education here in the United States, but also in that there's a lot of emerging research coming out really on a monthly basis that helps inform how we think about measuring it, how we think about implementing it. And across the board, we've been seeing for decades really now a lot of really positive benefits when we teach and model social emotional learning in schools. And I would love to hear from your side, Dan, how does SEL look in your school or district, and specifically in your role? What role do you play implementing that with students?
Yeah, it is such an important component of within our school program. So, as a school social worker, we're oftentimes working with our students on individual education plans that target social emotional learning and target strategies around like self-awareness and self-management, or just growth within the context of your own emotional growth. Empathy is just a huge social skill that is actually, I think it's one of the most difficult ones to actually teach or comprehend, but it's such an important piece of this, and I think that ties in well with SEL work. When you think about working in pairs, so kids working together on a project, focuses on those relationship skills, decision making, all those kinds of things pair well with just the work that we're doing in schools to support students, but then also how that relates so well with academics and focusing on instruction. And when I just think about myself too, as having two kids with one of them is on an IEP for emotional behavior disorder, so EBD, and the other one has autism spectrum disorder. Both of them have challenges in terms of in context of how they relate with their peers. And so work around SEL is so critical and important for their growth and their mental health, and then also kind of how they can comprehend the work that they're doing in terms of their academics. So just really, really important focus on how these things relate well with the work we're doing in schools, and pair well with school social workers, and a lot of the work that we're doing anyway to support classroom instruction. The next question, I was just wondering, can you share your thoughts of how distant learning, so just thinking about how things have changed since COVID has kind of come as a piece of school, and can you share your thoughts about how distant learning is impacted or has impacted our children's social emotional learning, and particularly children with neurological conditions, how this might impact them additionally, or what struggles that this might have in terms of distant learning and kind of the new norm that's come in front of us this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such an important question, and we'd really love to hear your perspective as well, both as a parent, as you were just outlining, but also in your role and what you're observing, maybe anecdotally. But I think a lot of the discourse, apologies if you can hear my puppy in the background, a lot of the discourse around distance learning and the pandemic is really focused, I think, too heavily on academic learning loss in K through 12, which it's certainly significant. But less attention has been paid to the social emotional impact on students. And what we're seeing so far is that the shutdowns last spring resulted in some negative effects on students' social and emotional development. So although the research is still emerging, we do know that school closures, social distancing, and confinement increases anxiety and stress among children in normal circumstances, and reduces access to vital family and care services. And so there's been a few studies. One that stands out was a national survey of 3,300 students that was conducted by America's Promise this summer. And what it found is that about a third of students that were surveyed reported feelings of depression and anxiety since their schools closed. And 25% reported a lack of connection to their peers, to their teachers, and their school communities. And so that's kind of the population at large. When we think about students with disabilities or at risk for disabilities or neurological conditions, prior to the school year, the overwhelming expectation was that they will be needing additional social, emotional, and behavioral supports due to both disruptions in instruction caused by hybrid learning, but also unequal access to that instruction. And so when you compound that with the fact that federal and district regulations in most states are requiring all students, teachers, staff to wear masks in school buildings, to maintain safe distancing, which are certainly positive from a health standpoint, but in terms of a connection and sense of belonging standpoint, which we know is so important to development, it makes that even more challenging.
Right. Yeah, I concur with you when you're talking about that importance around connection and relationship. So critical when you think about some of the students that's starting out the school year in a new classroom with a new teacher, and their first interaction with them is virtually. It really creates a different kind of barrier in terms of relationship building that is so important. Not only as me as a staff person working with other students in a school, but also just the importance around relationship when you talk about your own kids, or or focusing on that aspect of like me being here with my kids to support them through this. I also worry and wonder about traditional learning strategies, right? So that being something, as we would do that in person, kids in special education, oftentimes kids with neurological disorders, those traditional strategies don't work or haven't worked, which is why they're on, in special ed, or which is why they have another layer of need. So us going virtual, we're kind of, doing this one way, and we're hoping that this kind of works for all kids. In the reality, though, I think about my own children. My little one is so active and he's so relationship based. For him not to have that kind of in person, close kind of interaction and support, he really, it's hard for him to focus and and feel connected on a virtual screen. And so I know that that's been a challenge for him in terms of, he gets his instruction through the screen, but then it really misses out on some of the things that I think we're talking about, and the importance around what some of this is playing out for him, is that he's having more difficulty understanding the concepts of what they're trying to teach him through a screen or through a worksheet. So good information. As we kind of talk about this, we'll probably have some other ideas about some other examples. But next one I was wondering about or thinking about, have you heard of any specific other models that have kind of been proven to be more effective, or support social emotional learning during this kind of new way of delivering instruction? I think of myself, for both my little one and my older one, some of the ways that they're delivering the instruction has worked really well, and actually even worked better to some degree in supporting their learning, and some ways I think have not worked as well. Like for instance, my little one gets information through the screen, and all of his assignments for the whole day pops up on the screen, and sometimes it's like 30 assignments. for a kid that's in special education to see he's got 30 assignments at 8 in the morning and he's got to figure out a way to work through them. That's really a difficult way for him to even start the day when you're thinking about, wanting to make sure that they, they're challenged, but not so challenged that they feel overwhelmed. So yeah, I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about any models that you've come up with that?
Yeah. It's as you were kind of saying, it's a really difficult one, especially in districts in which the academic rigor, which is important, but is not balanced with that kind of care and belonging that we were talking about. And so I think when we think about SEL in virtual settings, there's definitely an element of keeping it simple and not trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think for a lot of teachers, it can be generally overwhelming where they're stressed. They may not feel as though they have time within the school day to do SEL. But more and more teachers are learning that both all learning is social emotional. Every kind of teaching moment is an SEL moment. And so you don't necessarily, if you can dedicate, 15 minutes to it within a day, that's great. But if not, it can also just be embedded within lesson plans or projects or whatever you're already teaching. So those great strategies that teachers already have and rituals that they were using in person with students, instead of abandoning those and trying to come up with new ones, can we find low effort ways to just adapt those in-person strategies and use them virtually? So things like daily morning meeting or checking in with students or journaling. Those are all rituals that help a student start the day, get comfortable, build that relationship with the teacher. Those can still be done virtually. There's lots of great free resources on Teachers Pay Teachers or other websites where you can use Zoom or Google Classroom or other technology platforms to recreate, although obviously not the same as in person, it's still better than nothing. So really thinking a little bit deliberately about how you can do that. And what you mentioned around needing more targeted supports as well, I think is really important. And so obviously we need, when you think about MTSS or kind of systems of support for students, we need universal supports for all and every learner. But then we have to recognize that, especially in a time when learning differences are exacerbated because of hybrid learning, that we need more tailored and more personalized supports for individual students as well. And so ultimately, I think one of the trends that I'm hopeful is that schools across the country are seeing that we need to be really focusing on relationships and creating those safe and consistent rituals early in the school year, potentially even for the first several months, before rushing into the scenario you played out, which is students overwhelmed with all these assignments and they don't have that foundation of, I feel safe, I feel like I belong here, I feel like I have a relationship and I can ask for support. Because it's clear that students are returning to classrooms, whether it's in person or virtually, with a great deal of stress and trauma, and in some cases, trauma and anxiety. So kind of going back to the original question, I think one broad recommendation about effective models for SEL is really being intentional about how are we creating that sense of belonging and safety and community. Can we do that virtually? I think we can. And in order to do that, it extends beyond just the student-teacher relationship, but relationships with caregivers and families. And also, can you leverage community serving organizations that may already be out in the community helping those same families? Can you bring them in and help create more of those wraparound services for students?
Right. Yeah. Just as you're talking, some things I think about. Number one, we all just need to give ourselves some grace in terms of what's going on right now with COVID. And I think maybe pull back and think about, what do we need to be focusing on first? And I think it really should revolve around the conversations we're having about social emotional learning and relationship, and talking about feelings and how we're feeling or how stressed we are, and that being kind of a priority over, learning about like what's the next multiplication set of things that we have to focus on, because the reality is that if we're not mentally healthy, we won't be able to learn 2 + 2, right? So we really need to have a mindset in our body of being, healthy and feeling safe and secure before we're going to be able to learn new concepts. The other things I was just thinking about in terms of ways, that we could add in, or I've seen, working as a school social worker and working with across other school districts as well, that, ways that we really need to be embedding our work within SEL into everything we do. And there's ways to do that, like even as part of like a math lesson, even as part of science, even as part of check-in. I feel like teachers or any adult, it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, a social worker, or you're a parent, there's ways to embed this within conversation and context and everything that we're doing. Like the check-in in the morning, a piece of that is relationship, right? So if we can get other kids on the screen together and people just having a sense of like, we're all going through this together, I feel like that was a helpful tool even for not only my younger one, but my older one too, because kids are just like, well, I want to be back in school. Why aren't I back in school? It's almost like a sense of like, am I being punished for something? But then when they see that other kids are also going through the same or similar experience, I think that really helps them conceptualize kind of what's happening. It's not just, there's a bigger context to it, and it's not just like they've done something wrong or something. And then when you're talking about check-in, I think about ways that, we can have a check-in and talk about a different feeling each day as part of your check-in. It's also and oftentimes that kind of face-to-face component is also a way that many school districts are using that to take attendance. So they ask a question about something that's specific, and then the student has to report back, usually, through a recorded message about whatever question it was, and then that's how the parent, or that's how the school district or the teacher then takes attendance that person, made that connection for that day. How I do it as a parent. We have, and you were talking about rituals, which I think are so important and critical. We have a check-in every single day, and doesn't matter if it's our kids or someone new that's joining the dinner table in the evening. We have 3 things that we go through, and one is something that we enjoyed today. So, we're talking about something you enjoyed, something that you're looking for, and something that you're appreciative of. And we have those 3 questions as part of our kind of ritual and routine and check-in. And those integrate so many of the things that you're talking about, or we're discussing when you talk about social emotional learning and and how we're feeling and concepts of that. So that's just one example that, we've really embedded in that. And I think that also helps even some of the older kids that, you ask like, how are you doing today? And they're like, good.
Yeah.
Well, good. I don't really know what that means. That's not really a feeling word in terms of what I'm trying to get at. So if you kind of ask questions that don't exist, that won't get that output of like, yes, no, good, bad, but you have to add more context to it, that oftentimes like equips or supports kids to articulate or move beyond kind of those one word answers that we want to get away from.
Totally agree. I love that example you gave, because I think when you think about those check-in exercises, they're not only beneficial for the ritualized component, but you think about emotion labeling that comes up all the time. You also think about the adult side, which you mentioned in terms of modeling grace for ourselves and for others. A big piece when we are thinking about social emotional learning this academic year is that it's falling on the adults. The adults need to have the capacity for their own self-care and well-being in order to then be able to instill it and model it for students. And so can we think about even tools that are both simultaneously helpful for building that adult belonging and self-care in buildings, and students. So check-ins are like a great way. I would highly recommend any school or district think about if we're doing check-ins for students, are we also doing check-ins for our adults in the building and creating spaces for them, just like we would for students to ask for help and support.
Absolutely. That's great. Yeah. So important. Self-care, right? So we can't help. It's kind of like you gotta do and what the things that we're asking our kids to do. So, I actually, that kind of led me to an example of like, I was so stressed out the other day and I was like, oh my God, I'm getting so frustrated. I noticed that. And so like, I told my kids, like, Papa's going to take a 5-minute break. And I went and, so I was doing some of that modeling of just being, it's okay, like taking a break, and it doesn't have to be a punishment. Kids think of like consequences as being something like, well, all consequences are bad. And I'm really trying to, teach my kids, or even kids that I work with within the school, that, consequences, there's consequences for everything. Like there's a consequence for me. If I don't go to work, I don't get a paycheck, right? But there's also really positive consequences too. So I think we, being able to model and role model some of those things, that really does break it down, I think, for kids. And then they see that it's not necessarily just about like us focusing on the negative, which totally. I think is quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's so not the way that we're traditionally taught to deal with our emotions, right? We're not traditionally taught, model them, be out front with them, but just that act of saying, I'm really frustrated right now. I'm going to take a moment to breathe. It's okay that I'm frustrated. Mm-hmm. This is how I'm handling it. And even you mentioned earlier with can we embed social emotional learning in everything we do in academics? Math in particular, there's some great examples. Joe Bowler is one in particular that comes to mind at Stanford, and she has an organization, U-Cubed, where she basically will model for students the act of making a mistake in a mathematics lesson. And instead of getting down on herself and frustrated, it's, a synapse just fired in my brain. When I make a mistake, I'm actually building those muscles in my brain to understand this material. So there's so many different ways that modeling component for educators, for parents. And like you said before, it can really be anyone in the school building. A librarian can do it. If you're a hall monitor, you can do it. There's those little moments that if you think deliberately about, students do pick up on it.
Yep. That's great. Yeah, we're and I'm like, I'm in Minnesota, and we're actually doing we're pairing our social emotional learning is through Minnesota Department of Education. We're pairing it into the curriculum or instruction. So we have some really good examples of ways that we're making sure that like it pairs well with, in terms of how we're delivering instruction, that I think is really fascinating and unique. And we're doing some really neat stuff, I think, in Minnesota. So the next question I had was, and this kind of relates to, what's happening specifically with COVID, I think too. So, parents are having to make some parents are making some choices about, in-person classes based on their concern with SEL, and how things have been playing out in terms of, us being virtual or hybrid, or what's happening. And some parents are maybe even willing or are taking some risks in their child getting exposed to COVID, because they just feel like they need to have their son or daughter back in school. Do you have any thoughts on this? And, what considerations do you think parents should have before kind of making those choices, or sending their kids back to school, if it might somehow, benefit them in terms of getting that extra support in terms of social emotional learning?
Yeah, it's certainly a difficult choice. It's not clear cut. It depends a lot on where you are, obviously. And I think it's really important to emphasize that parents are the experts in their own children. And when we think about families and schools working together, or family engagement, it's often an overlooked part, I think, of K-12 education. But really so important. And we know from the research that it's really impactful for students when their educators and their caregivers are working together as true partners, and their parents are viewed in an assets-based manner. And so I think that's one piece of it, just broadly, in that schools should be using this as an opportunity to rethink how they're engaging families, equitably. And I'm not an epidemiologist or a medical professional, so I wouldn't venture to give advice in terms of what's safe or not safe concerning the coronavirus. But I would say that districts and state departments of education really need to play a larger role in terms of helping parents, helping inform district leaders with data and with options. I think it does vary across the country. Not all states are the same, obviously, but there was a recent article in Education Week that was interviewing a public health expert at Brown University down in Rhode Island. And really the two takeaways were that schools need to be a bit bolder about reopening, but also it was really harshly criticizing federal governments for not helping them with more guidelines and more testing. It was one of the only, you think about restaurants and gyms, schools weren't really viewed in the same way by a lot of state legislators. And so it's tricky. So if I'm a parent and the state is telling me that cases are low in our district, we're, a green district if they're classifying it that way. There have been no cases or very few cases in the district. We have safety measures in place, and we have these contingency plans. If there were to be a positive test, then I'm probably more likely to send my child to school for in-person learning. But every situation is different and every child is different. And parents will know my son or daughter, maybe they're in secondary school already, in high school, and the social component isn't that big for them because they can see their friends in extracurriculars still. Or conversely, my son or daughter's a second grader and the social piece is just so important right now. And because of the other metrics and where we live, I'm okay with taking the risk because the benefit of them being in person for SEL is so great. And just knowing too what your district is doing in terms of academics and SEL virtually. I know all districts are working very hard to keep academic rigor high and to support students virtually, but it's a struggle. It's a struggle. And I think asking those questions of your son or daughter's teacher, of the principal or district administrator is really important, because the reality in many parts of the country, certainly here in the Northeast, is that we're likely going to be virtual for at least the next several months, if not longer. So if schools already haven't started to really plan long-term for those systems and structures to support students online, they need to really be looking at it right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's kind of an individualized piece that parents need to think about. And, we've actually found in my school district, we've actually found some kids that the virtual way of, or what we're doing is actually increased their interest. So it's actually worked really well for some kids that maybe we've had historically had some problems with trying to get them to participate in the work or the instruction, and now this virtual way of doing things has actually increased their participation. So that might be an example, and that is kind of true with my oldest. Like he's on it and he's doing really great with the virtual instruction, and so that's working really well with him. Where some kids, if you have the opportunity or you have kind of like in Minnesota, all parents can choose, like if they go back, if the district goes back as like hybrid, parents can still choose to be virtual. So they get to have a choice whether they want to send their kid back virtual or if they just want to stay hybrid or not. And so that might be a case where, a parent might be like, no, things are actually going really good right now. I don't want to lose the momentum that we're having. So we might, keep on being virtual compared to doing something of a hybrid nature, and vice versa. You might just have, some kids that just are craving that in-person instruction time, and just a little piece of that might really support them in some of their own mental health needs. I know parents in general are really struggling too. You know, they might have their own stresses and, you know, as well. And so being able to have their son or daughter go back, even if it's part-time, really gives them some support, social and emotionally too, to kind of recoup and fill their buckets so that way they can be the best parents they can be too. Yeah, so any do you have any suggestions on ways, and I've given kind of a couple that, you know, I can think of, but are there other suggestions or ways that you think caregivers can support social emotional learning from home? So this would be just, you know, ideas about, like we talked about rituals and routines. We talked about, you know, we have a lot of like we have a feeling chart for my little one, and we try and really stay away from, you know, good and bad, but like, is there another way you could describe like how you're feeling and things like that? Do you have some ideas about ways that parents or caregivers can support social emotional learning in the context of, you know, when our kids are home with us?
Yeah. And I love, Dan, all the examples you just shared. I think those are some great, really practical and relatively easy to implement ones. I think there's two parts I would say in terms of caregiver supporting SEL in the home. One part is extending what's happening in your student's classroom explicitly into the home. And then the other part is just kind of parenting at large. And so it connects a little bit back to what I was saying earlier around family school partnerships. And I would really, if I'm a parent, put the onus on my school to be sending me home information about what is your mission for social emotional learning? What is the vision? How are you defining it? What language are you using? Because there should be, and always typically is, common language that teachers and students are using in classrooms. And that starts likely from principal or different leaders in your school. And so ideally schools are already sending that home and saying, these are ways that you can extend what we're doing. Unfortunately, schools don't always do a great job of communicating this. And so parents are often left to their own devices, but parenting isn't, in, you know, many ways, maybe always, about helping your child develop socially and emotionally. It's just an inherent part of a child growing up. And so I think some more explicit recommendations to likely mirror what's being done in your student's classroom. We've talked about at length modeling already. That's just a great one to get in the habit of doing. You'll see that your student, or your child rather, starts to do it as well. They're likely already doing it in their classrooms, hopefully. Another easy one, especially because we're at home so much and there's likely a lot of television or movie or potentially book watching, or obviously news, but using the news cycle or using books or TV to really engage in discussions. And they're just full of opportunities to talk about, you know, morality, to talk about goal setting, to talk about relationships and pro-social behaviors. So using that book that your child's reading to engage with them in discussions about why do you think the main character did what he did, or what were some other options he could have had, or pausing a TV show to talk about some type of relationship drama that may have been happening with two main characters. Similarly, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, that's kind of another thing. So sometimes we'll have I'm just, you know, as a parent example. So at home, like my kids will want to watch a movie. I don't know, Stormtroopers or Star Wars or whatever it is. We kind of have a rule that, like, if we're going to watch that movie, we got to talk about, like, what was the moral of the story, or what was the moral of the movie, and who were the good characters and who were the ones maybe that weren't good, and why was that? And to try and bring in some discussion and articulation about, like, you know, what was the effect of what happened and how did that affect people? And there's ways of doing that. You know, there were different kind of ways I would approach that question with my 8-year-old compared to my 19-year-old. But I think that's just such an important way that we can, you know, as parents or even as professionals too. I think about, you know, sometimes we'll have like a movie day and we'll let them watch a movie on something, you know, like, you know, the Friday movie day if they got all their work done at school. But I think there needs to be, or should, and there probably is, but needs to have more discussion about, like, what was the context of what we watched and how did that, like, affect those people, what were the emotions that kind of came out through it, what happened. There's ways I think that we can do that, even in context of like a story, like you mentioned, reading a book, but then also even in movies, which is sometimes more those like preferred things that the kids are like, oh my God, yeah, if I can watch that movie, I'll get the assignments done.
Totally. And yeah, I mean, it's really just all about helping them see the perspective taking, and even we talked about before, empathy. And you don't need to have all the answers. It's not necessarily about asking them questions they need to have answers to. It's just opening up space for them to discuss and really grapple with some of those ideas. And developmentally, depending on their age, they might be on the cusp of being able to grasp the empathy piece, or maybe they're a little bit younger, so it's more about just relationships and kind of decision making. And especially now, just given obviously the craziness of this week and kind of the election cycle that we're in, the reality is that students are likely, maybe they're not watching network news, but they're on their phones, they're consuming news in some way, shape, or form. And knowing that, it's really asking them how they're feeling, opening up space to ask you questions, just to talk about and process it. That's just another really, I think, helpful way in knowing that they're likely seeing things that might be stressful, a helpful way to help model the social emotional learning piece. And the only kind of final activity that I would recommend is mindfulness. And I think there's both a plethora of benefits, both for adults and for children, for practicing mindfulness. And more schools, especially in the elementary levels, are starting to introduce some type of mindfulness practice. So ideally, your kids are already kind of used to it or open to trying it. But that's a great way I've seen a lot of families do, is taking that moment for pause in the morning, maybe before dinner, maybe, even just a mindful walk, and not necessarily sitting and meditating like most of us imagine when you hear mindfulness, but being able to take a walk out in nature together and just taking note of the colors and the scents and the smells. That's another SEL adjacent activity I would say that you could do as a parent in the home.
Yeah, I just that kind of reminded me of so we also, in my school district, and a lot of kinds of, when we have like groups or of any kind of sort, we try and make sure that kids, and we practice it as well, we try and make sure that kids are kind of have a toolbox of different ways of strategies that they can pull from, in terms of managing like stress. So like we have like a 10-week group that we teach, and part of it is like we make sure that they all have try doing, we do deep breathing, pleasant imagery, and backwards counting. And then there's a piece on moral reasoning, but it's really about like trying to incorporate different strategies. That could be mindfulness, that could be, we also use things like neurofeedback and heart math and things like that, but to try different things out, and try and get the kids to at least be exposed to different strategies like that would support, being mindful, or having some of these different strategies, so that way, some of them might be like, well, that didn't work for me. I'm like, well, what about one of the other ones? And again, it's really about just trying it, because maybe for someone it's drawing, or maybe for someone it's something else, but without us even giving a try or even being exposed to it, then we know that, well, if we haven't given a try, then it probably is not going to work. So we try and open those doors up.
Yeah, I love that toolbox analogy, because it's so important to recognize that it's definitely not a one size fits all in terms of what rituals or tools are helpful for students. I mean, my wife could never sit down and meditate for 10 minutes, but she goes on runs, and that's kind of her meditation, which is probably not a great comparison for students. But to your point, it's giving them the tools and the different options so that they can find things and maybe even tweak different ones that will really work for them, that they know, okay, I'm stressed, this is a tough homework assignment, or I have a bunch of projects coming up, I can dip into that toolbox, ideally even with my parents, and talk something out or take that moment for pause.
Yeah, we there's some, because of COVID and everything that's hit, we've actually created they're virtual calming rooms that we've created in some, you'll see a lot of that happening in school districts. So people can go to like a link and there's like a virtual calming room that's been created that you can then use to do some of this, the mindfulness that we're talking about now. So there's some really interesting and creative things that are happening. Like COVID is obviously not a good thing and everyone wishes it away, but I think it has, coming back to your kind of comment at the beginning, there are different ways that I think we as school district staff, but also as like people working in therapy, need to think outside the box about how we have been traditionally doing things for 10, 20, or 100 years. And there's some other ways that we can maybe participate in this process, and it's only going to grow like our own skill sets, but then also help kids and families in terms of things that maybe they haven't been exposed to, and maybe a new way that might work better than what's traditionally been happening.
Totally agree.
Yeah, so I just thought kind of as a kind of closing question or thing. I know that they'll be able to post like articles or research or kinds of studies. Do you have any things or thoughts about really good articles or discussion kinds of studies or something that might be something that a parent might look at or look into or notice or maybe think about that would be relevant to kind of the discussion that we've talked about today, that might be a good resource for parents to like draw from, or even research articles that you think maybe a school district could utilize to think about this differently or think about this in the future?
Yeah, I think fortunately there's been a lot of resources and guidelines that have come out specifically both for school districts, but also for parents in terms of helping your child cope with emotion, stress, anxiety during the pandemic. And I think long story short, we know that when children, when adolescents spend their daytime hours in safe, supportive environments in which the adults they're with are, working to build strong relationships with them, inclusive relationships with them, they're going to be more engaged, they're going to be happier, they're going to be more confident. And so it's that belonging and that connectedness that we've talked about earlier that applies at home, that applies in classrooms, it applies virtually. And I think I would look to, in terms of sources, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and Dr. Chris Cipriano in particular has done a lot of research and discussions around social emotional learning in our current context, and specifically with learners with neurological conditions. That's one place I would look. CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning I mentioned earlier, has a lot of different great resources. Common Sense Media is another one. They're more on the media literacy side, so they provide recommendations and ratings for TV shows and movies for parents, but they have a ton of different lists, like the 17 best apps to help kids stay focused, or the 9 best movies to talk about morality with kids. Lots of awesome content there. Certainly in different tools, different toolkits that both parents and educators can use. So those are some places I would look. I'll put a link in the chat as well. On Inside SEL, we've been kind of curating over the past several months just a really long list with a bunch of different resources in those different, parenting bucket, school leader bucket, even just adult self-care and mindfulness as well. So you can find a bunch of different options on our website there.
Yeah, I've been fascinated about just even how many apps have come out to like support kids or families or people in like self-care apps or kind of virtual calming rooms or activities that you can do. There's been a lot of interesting apps that have come out that are pretty useful too, but those are fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I do you have any other thoughts before we close today? Or
I think last thing I would say is really to echo what you said earlier, Dan, which is in this super volatile and uncertain time, give yourself space, give yourself grace, take a moment to pause, and know that while it can certainly feel isolating and challenging at times, whether you're a parent, whether you're a student, whether you're an educator, we are collectively all in this together. And there are a lot of really, really smart, driven people doing the important work to try to help make sure that we have systems in place for virtual learners that make sure that they're supported from the social and emotional side of learning.
Very good.
Awesome. Thank you both. This was a really great conversation. I feel like it's something we could talk about all day long. But yeah, I learned a lot. I have some ideas that I'm going to throw on my kids today. We'll see how they take it. But I just really want to thank you both for sharing your expertise and taking the time with us today. The Child Neurology Foundation has put together a lot of interviews and content like this, and you can get access to it at childneurologyfoundation.org/COVID-19. Together, we will get through this, and together, we are all child neurology. Thank you.